Hey everyone, this is Liberty Cabbage, and I'll be reviewing an untitled webcomic by Rob O'Brien. This is a particularly personal webcomic, and before I start, I'd like to briefly introduce another personal comic I'm a fan of. This is My Troubles with Women by Robert Crumb, which is basically about the author's obsession with unconventionally attractive women, and sort of how he feels he's basically a perverted creep about it. And I like how it's very honest about the author's flaws, and how he feels sort of guilty about how he uses his status as a famous cartoonist to manipulate women to have sex with him. And by the end of it, he's ultimately seems very human and relatable. He knows he's not perfect, but he's basically a good person who's just maybe a little sick and twisted sometimes. So definitely recommend that in Crumb's work. With that said, I'll move on to the writing critique. Alright, so this comic's about a cartoonist who is obsessed with a female pop star, and it's pretty obvious that this is related to O'Brien's personal life. On his website, he's got a page describing himself, and where he says he's more than a bit of a Taylor Swift fan, and lists one of his life goals as marrying Taylor Swift. He also has a page explaining his obsession with Taylor Swift, and there's an illustration of him with Taylor Swift that he drew. And basically the story thus far is that this cartoonist is very successful. The pop star is a fan of the comic. They meet, fall in love, and everything is hunky-dory. Well, in My Troubles with Women, Crumb portrays himself as a perverted loser. In this comic, the protagonist is a perfect Mary Sue. He's a successful professional cartoonist. He's intelligent. He's charming. And he's got the hottest, most successful pop star in the world drooling all over him. His only real thing that can be considered a flaw is that he's unattractive. But the comic actually portrays attractive men as being shallow and stupid, so it's really not even a flaw here. And really the main point of the comic seems to be to show how amazing this protagonist is, and how him and the pop star have sort of this perfect fairy tale relationship. And the comic is about 50 pages in, and there's really no conflict or problems at all yet, which basically makes the story very uninteresting and boring to me. And while I assume there will be conflicts later on, it's really taking much too long to get to any sort of real plot. Brian's done some grayscale work before on a different project, but as far as I can tell, this is his first black and white comic, and I give him some credit for trying something a little different. Unfortunately, he doesn't really seem to get how black and white artwork functions. With black and white comics, there's a certain focus on things like hatching, cross-hatching, contrast, shadows, lighting, that sort of thing that really requires a different sort of skills than a colored comic. And this seems more just like a colored comic that he didn't really feel like bothering to color. So I would definitely suggest for him to look at more quality black and white comics and observe sort of the different techniques those creators use to make the comics visually exciting without having color, since color really helps quite a bit. That out of the way, I'd like to cover some anatomy issues, and I'll be using myself as a visual reference to point some of them out. When I illustrate, I like to pose in front of a mirror or take pictures of myself with a camera to use as a reference. And I find it very useful for things like difficult poses or some sort of action shots, but you can also just use it for general anatomy. One of the issues I've noticed a lot with this comic is that elbows tend to be too long. And I'll use myself as a reference. You can see that my elbow goes down to about the base of my rib cage. Whereas in this comic, it's usually more down to around the waist level, which ends up really throwing off the whole proportions of the body. So it's definitely something to keep track of. Another issue I saw a lot is that wrists and ankles tend to be very, very thin, almost like skeletal. And you can see for a reference here that really there's not that much of a difference in width between elbow and wrist. I'd say that the wrist is probably about 80% of the width of the elbow. So it's really shouldn't be that drastic where you kind of get that pointiness that's in this comic. So it's definitely something to keep track of. And just in general, it's useful just to have the right proportions of things in the comic, like neck to head ratio, arms to body ratio, head to body ratio, and really any kind of anatomy. It's very simple solution just to look in a mirror, but I do find it very useful, at least for getting a general kind of body type down. And then once you become more experienced, you can experiment with different body types, different sexes, and just more complex angles and perspectives and things like that. The last things I'd like to talk about with the artwork are some issues I have with how O'Brien draws women. The pop star in the comic is very skinny to the point of being skeletal and sickly looking, yet all the men in the comic gush over how hot she is. And it creates a definite sense of disconnect between what I see myself and what the characters say in response to her. And so it almost seems like a sort of alternate reality where the ideas of beauty and attractiveness in the comic are different than those in real life. So I would recommend for O'Brien to look at pictures of real pop stars, real models, and get a better sense of what's considered attractive in terms of weight and figure. Another thing I found strange was that on page 35, the pop star is wearing the dress from Beauty and the Beast that Belle wears, and I noticed that O'Brien lists Beauty and the Beast as one of his favorite movies on the site, so there definitely seems to be a connection. And it just seems very strange that a pop star will go to an award ceremony cosplaying as a Disney princess. I can't really imagine that happening, and I don't really know what O'Brien was thinking when he drew that. There doesn't seem to be a lot of effort put into this comic, and it still has a lot of the same flaws as O'Brien's last comic, such as bland perspectives and the characters not showing a lot of emotion and their facial expressions. And I really would prefer the writing to be a bit more honest and realistic than it is. Moving forward, I noticed on the Y. Taylor page that O'Brien went into some detail about his issues with depression and how Taylor Swift inspired him to be a better person, and I think that would be much more interesting subject matter than what's been presented so far. O'Brien requested some advice in what to name the comic since it doesn't actually have a title, and I think something like Fairy Tale Ending, My Fantasy Life, or Dream Girl, or something like that would be better, and the idea being something that acknowledges that the comic is basically a wish fulfillment fantasy with a Mary Sue protagonist. I'd score the writing as a 1 out of 5 and the art as a 1 out of 5 for an overall of 1 out of 5. Thanks for watching.